Welcome to the Religious Studies podcast. This deep dive into the intersection of religion and tourism is generated using AI. And just so you know, all the information has been fact-checked by Bastian Freiburg. Today, we're looking at how these two really fascinating areas connect and interact. We're drawing from quite a range of articles and research. Our goal here is really to pull out the most valuable insights, giving you, our listeners interested in religious studies, a quick yet pretty thorough understanding of what's going on in this field. We've got quite a stack of sources, actually. Pieces from Tourism Embassy, a detailed academic paper from the Crowther Journal on economic development drivers, an article from Ripkatha Journal on reconciling spiritual and cultural heritage, Wikipedia's overview, an article from Parag Pandits on ethics in India, a market research summary, a mention from Economic Annals XCI on pilgrimage economics, and even a UN World Tourism Organization report. Quite a lot to sift through. So from all this, we really want to uncover that multifaceted relationship. How do religious sites become tourist spots? Why do people travel for religious reasons? What are the impacts economically and socially, the ethical side of things, and what does the future look like? Let's dive right in, maybe starting with the history. It seems like religion and tourism have been linked for a very long time.
They absolutely have, a very long time. Our sources really emphasize that religion has, well, profoundly shaped tourism for millennia. Religious sites were often, the original tourist attractions, if you think about it. And if you study the history of religion itself, going back at least 2,000 years, travel and visiting these sites is a huge part of its story, its growth, its development. It's not new.
And we're talking big numbers here, right? This isn't a niche interest. It's a massive global movement.
Oh, absolutely massive. Millions and millions of travelers every single year are involved in religious and cultural tourism. And that's not just visiting, say, a famous cathedral. It's also participating in festivals, experiencing cultural practices that are deeply tied to religious beliefs.
Okay, so for our audience in religious studies, what are the main motivations that scholars are looking at? And do the sources break down different sort of types of religious tourism?
Yes, they do. And from a religious studies angle, the motivations are quite diverse, as you'd expect. The sources often distinguish between, say, pilgrimage tourism, which is really driven by spiritual needs, participating in rituals. And then there's what some call church tourism, maybe a slightly clunky term, but it means focusing more on the monuments themselves, their art, their architecture.
But those lines can blur, presumably. Someone might go for the art but still feel something spiritual.
Precisely. They're not always mutually exclusive at all. You might be drawn by faith, absolutely. But equally, it could be an appreciation for art, architecture, history, even exploring personal ancestry tied to a place. These sacred spaces, they can be deeply moving. Interesting, too, for both religious people and those who aren't. There's that concept in religious studies of liminality, that kind of in-between state during pilgrimage outside normal life. That can be incredibly powerful for anyone.
That's a really great point about liminality. Can you give us some concrete examples, sites that draw these different kinds of visitors?
Sure. Think about the sanctuary of Our Lady of Fatima in Portugal. That's a prime example of pilgrimage, drawing people seeking spiritual comfort, linked to the Marian apparitions. Then you have Jerusalem, obviously profoundly significant for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It attracts pilgrims, yes, but also huge numbers interested in its history and culture.
Right.
And the Way of St. James in Spain, the Camino, that's fascinating because it attracts both deeply religious pilgrims and increasingly secular individuals seeking maybe a personal challenge or self-discovery. India, of course, shows incredible diversity. Sites for Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Islam, plus yoga tourism, amazing religious architecture. And Japan, too. Beautiful Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines attracting visitors for all sorts of reasons.
It really strikes me how many of these places have that dual role. They're active places of worship, but also major cultural and historical landmarks.
That duality is absolutely central. You've hit on a key point there. Religious heritage has this cultural value, history, art, identity, but also this intrinsic religious value as a spiritual center for believers. And that dual nature, which the Ripkatha Journal article discusses, well, it creates a really dynamic, sometimes challenging situation when that heritage also becomes an economic resource, part of tourism, interacting with broader cultural heritage efforts.
You mentioned challenges. Can you expand on that a bit, especially thinking about it from, say, a sociology or anthropology of religion perspective?
Well, a key issue is that potential tension. How do you preserve the sacredness, the integrity of a site, while also promoting it for tourists? The Rupkatha article touches on this, noting the efforts to develop and protect heritage, but crucially, emphasizing how important community involvement is. For scholars of religion, looking at how these local communities navigate the economic opportunities versus preserving their traditions and the sacredness of place, that's a really vital area of study.
Okay, let's shift gears a little towards the economics. We've touched on it. But what does the research actually say about the financial impact? Is it significant?
Oh, it's considerable and quite varied. Religious and cultural tourism definitely support local economies. Think hospitality, shops, guides. The Crowther Journal paper gives some interesting data. In Nigeria, for instance, religious tourism is seen as actually contributing to social stability and unity among different ethnic groups.
That's fascinating, beyond just money.
Exactly. And economically, tourism overall contributed, let me see, 3.20% to Nigeria's GDP back in 2013 and accounted for 2.70% of total employment. So the impact isn't just revenue, it can have these broader social implications too.
And are there specific events, maybe festivals, that really drive this economic activity?
Yes, absolutely. Religious festivals are huge drivers. The Gun Festival in Nigeria, for example, it creates real economic opportunities for local businesses. Events like that can also put the host communities on the map globally as tourist destinations, generating revenue through taxes, permits, spurring development of facilities. The Calabar Carnival, also in Nigeria, is another example. It blends cultural and religious elements, attracting tourists and boosting hotels, restaurants, craft markets. For researchers looking at religious economies, these festivals are really valuable case studies.
Okay, so there are clear economic benefits. But what about the potential downsides? Any ethical red flags our sources raise?
Definitely. It's not all positive economic impact. The sources point to potential negatives, too. There's the risk of what gets called cultural commoditization. That's where religious practices or objects get treated mainly as things to be bought and sold, potentially stripping them of their deeper meaning.
Right, I can see that.
There are also environmental concerns, degradation from too many visitors, and the potential disruption to local religious life if tourism isn't managed sensitively. This is why sustainable practices are so crucial, to lessen these impacts and respect the authenticity of these sacred places.
How are places like India, with such deep and diverse traditions, grappling with this?
Well, the article from Prayag Pandits gives us some insight there. A major challenge in India is finding that balance between, devotion and commercialization around sacred sites, making sure the sanctity of the space is protected, minimizing environmental damage. These are big priorities. And you have organizations like Prayag Pandits working specifically on ethical religious tourism. They emphasize spiritual integrity, environmental care, cultural respect. It really highlights how religious values themselves are being applied within the tourism sector. That's a really interesting area for applied religious studies.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where spirituality and economics can coexist without undermining each other.
Precisely. That's the goal, ideally. Because while commercial aspects can bring economic boosts, there's always that risk of watering down the spiritual experience. Scholars might even look at how different religious traditions themselves view this mixing of the sacred and the marketplace. It varies a lot.
Which brings us neatly to sustainable development and management. What are the key strategies the sources point to here?
Sustainability is paramount. That means things like carefully managing tourist numbers, avoiding that feeling of being totally overcrowded, actively working to reduce the environmental footprint, pushing eco-friendly options, and crucially, really engaging local communities, getting them involved in planning, in decisions. That helps ensure benefits are shared fairly and cultural traditions are protected.
Makes sense.
Effective management of the religious heritage itself is also key. You need to meet visitor expectations, but also protect the site's integrity for the long haul. The UN World Tourism Organization really emphasizes this need for sustainability, promoting what they call a virtuous cycle of local development covering economic, environmental, social, cultural, and ethical aspects.
Looking ahead then, what trends are emerging? What should those of us in religious studies keep an eye on?
Several interesting trends. Religious tourism is definitely becoming more international. People from all sorts of national and spiritual backgrounds are participating. Pilgrimages themselves are seeing larger numbers, that massification idea, but they're also changing, incorporating more recreational stuff, educational elements to meet modern expectations.
So not just austerity anymore.
Not always, no. It's a blend.
Oh.
That blending of traditional pilgrimage with broader tourism is a really fascinating area to study. Also, technology. Online platforms are playing a much bigger role now in managing sites, providing access, promoting religious tourism. Issues around safety, security, even insurance for religious travel are becoming more prominent too. And finally, destinations themselves are getting smarter about protecting and managing their religious heritage. More partnerships, using ethical guidelines like the Global Code of Ethics for tourism. For religious studies, this intersection of globalization, tech, and evolving religious practice within tourism offers really rich ground for future research.
Okay, so for our listeners particularly interested in religious studies, let's try and distill some key takeaways here. Our deep dive really shows this incredibly dynamic, constantly evolving relationship between religion and tourism. From those ancient pilgrimages that literally shaped landscapes to very modern spiritual journeys using budget airlines, that basic human desire to connect with something sacred, it's still a powerful driver for travel. And we've seen how this connection can fuel economies, yes, but also help preserve cultural heritage and maybe even foster some cross cultural understanding, all really central themes in religious studies.
And here's where it gets really pertinent for religious studies scholars. The sources consistently highlight this need for a careful, balanced approach. As these sites become popular tourist spots, really critical questions come up. How do you manage them to protect their spiritual meaning? How do you ensure environmental sustainability? How do you respect the local communities? The rise of ethical tourism initiatives offers fantastic case studies for understanding how religious values and principles are being negotiated and applied in our globalized world. Looking at the theological dimensions, the sociological impacts, the anthropological shifts, that's vital for contemporary religious scholarship.
So, for you listening, if you're deep in research on how pilgrimage has changed, or the impact of globalization on religious practice, or the ethics of managing secret heritage, understanding this complex interplay between religion and tourism offers really valuable perspectives and raises core questions for your work. Think about how different traditions even conceptualize travel to sacred sites, or the role religious authorities play in managing it all, or the potential for tourism to transform these landscapes for better or worse.
Absolutely. And honestly, this exploration has only just scratched the surface. There are so many avenues for deeper inquiries that are really promising for religious studies. You could investigate the specific ways different religions, say Islam versus Buddhism versus Christianity, shape tourist practices differently, or analyze how technology is changing the experience of pilgrimage today, or dig into the theological debates around commodifying the sacred. Just understanding the evolving motives and experiences of the religious tourist through that rigorous academic lens. That promises some fascinating and important insights.
Well, thank you for joining us on the Religious Studies podcast. If you found this deep dive insightful, please do follow the podcast and maybe consider giving us a 5-star rating. It really helps us reach even more listeners interested in exploring the fascinating world of religious studies.